present and past of the American worldview. A wonderfully interesting topic. Professor Legro is not only has studied this at great length, he's presently, as you know, at the University of Virginia, where he is the Compton Professor of World Politics in the Woodrow Wilson Department of Political Science. He also is a co-chair of America in the World, which is a program within the Miller School of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. He's a graduate of Middlebury College, PhD from UCLA, has consulted with foundations, various institutions, and certainly for governments as well. He had a Fulbright Fellowship at the Foreign Policy University in Beijing, which would have been a fascinating year, I'm sure. And as the author of several books, including in 2005, the one that I alluded to, which seems to be most directly related to what we've asked him to deal with tonight. So being deeply interested in his topic and curious, as we discussed earlier, about how he's going to approach it, it's an enormous pleasure to present Professor Jeffrey W. Legro.
Thanks very much, Frank. Very generous introduction, and it's a pleasure and honor to be here with you all tonight at the Baltimore Council of Foreign Affairs, an organization that has a critical mission, which is to help educate the public on foreign affairs. I was recently reminded how critical that is at a conference last week when a foreign scholar noted that Americans know more about Brittany than they do about Britain. And unfortunately, I think that's true. My question today, I think, is one that is at the center of American foreign policy and the center of the future of world politics, given the pivotal American role in foreign affairs today. And that is the future of the American worldview. And one can't help but have an opinion on this topic because you have no idea what I mean by worldview, so inevitably you have an opinion on it. But there's a lot of literature and a lot of writings out there, foreign affairs and elsewhere, on grand strategy. Grand strategy is a theory about how states can cause their security, and it's normally about military matters, sometimes economics. And I want to talk about a worldview which is somewhat different. It's at a higher level than grand strategy. It's about what world politics is about, which is politics, which is how the United States should relate to the international political structure. That is, should it be a part of it? Should it integrate in it? Should it remain outside of it, remain indifferent to it? Or should it overturn it and revolutionize it? And states differ in terms of where they stand vis-a-vis the international order. And they often have long-held views about how to deal with that order. And these views rarely change. So let me start with a puzzle. And the puzzle is this: the American worldview has only changed once since the founding. That is, up until World War II, the United States' attitude towards the international arena was to remain outside of it, to remain outside of the order mainly established by major powers, in this case, European major powers, to not become institutionally involved. What did the United States trade? Of course it did. Did the United States get involved in certain political relations with other countries? Of course it did, but it would not become institutionally involved with those major powers. Its mission was to remain aloof. In 1945, actually before that, as I'll mention in a minute, that all changed radically. And the United States decided not only to become involved, but to help organize and lead that order. And that has largely been its position, a defender and an integrator in the international order since 1945. And of course, that role of being an integrator somewhat altered with the Bush administration following 9/11. And there was an effort at that point to essentially revolutionize the order through American foreign policy. And the question is, why did that effort fail? Because I believe it has failed. And what's going to replace it? Now, many of you are quite happy that it failed because you're essentially, you're integrators. You adhere to this view that became dominant in the country after World War II of liberal internationalism. I call it Atlantic Pact internationalism because it was a fusion of American and European values that dominated the order. And I, in fact, have found that order very congenial too. But my argument today is that that order is in serious trouble, even as it's already returned, and I believe the Bush administration has returned basically to liberal internationalism. But that order is in serious trouble, and the alternatives could be much more dangerous and troubling to you than anything you may have seen if you were in fact troubled by the Bush revolution of the last few years. So I want to get at this by looking into the past a little bit and looking at 4 opportunities that Americans had to alter their worldview in this century. World War I, World War II, the end of the Cold War, and 9/11. And I want to lay out an argument why it was only World War II that there was change. And the argument is this: it's very difficult to alter these traditional views. It's a tough thing to do because they're embedded in popular rhetoric, in the attitudes of statesmen, in schools, their cultural views, and so they're difficult to change. And they're only possible to change in situations where events dramatically contradict the expectations of those dominant ideas and bad things happen. If good things happen, no one pays attention. Even if there's a contradiction with the dominant ideas, nothing happens, right? So for example, when stock markets go up dramatically, does anyone launch an investigation? No. Even if no one expected it, is there ever an investigation? No. When the stock market falls dramatically, there is always an investigation, right? So the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, 1993, the first one. Did anything happen out of that? No, right? It failed by an accident. Did we change policies? No, because nothing bad happened. We're only moved to rethink our ideas when bad things happen. That's what challenges those old ideas. But more than that, you also have to have some new idea to focus on, and that new idea has to show results. So in those 2 conditions, when there is collapse due to unmet expectations and bad results, and there's a prominent new idea that can show results, those are the conditions you get change, and they're difficult to meet. And as I said, they've only happened once. And if we go through that template, I think you'll start to understand why the Bush revolution has failed and why liberal internationalism is going to be in trouble. Okay, let's start with World War I. It's a puzzle, isn't it? Why didn't the U.S. take up leadership after World War I? Why didn't it do after World War I what it did after World War II? It was the strongest, the wealthiest country in the world after World War I. Easily could be the most powerful militarily. Statesmen made arguments that if the U.S. did not change its view towards international order. That is, did not get involved and committed to European security on a long-term basis, the same problems would come again. Franklin Roosevelt was one of those who made that argument at the time. But it didn't. The United States turned its back, as a government, let me say, turned its back on the world. Business was still very much involved in the world, but not the government. The government would not get institutionally committed, right? The rejection of the League of Nations. Why did this happen? Well, a lot of it had to do with Woodrow Wilson and World War I, right? When Woodrow Wilson entered World War I, it was a deviation from the long-held American worldview to that point. Don't get entangled in Europe. Washington's farewell address, read every year in Congress through the 19th century, indeed to today. We will not get entangled with Europe. Yes, we will trade with them, but we're not going to get involved, institutionally involved in their great power politics. Wilson enters the war, and people at the time said, don't do it. You're deviating from tradition. This isn't the American way. And he said, no, we need to do it. And the way he justified it was he needed to make the world safe for democracy. That if the U.S. intervened, it would further U.S. democracy and reforms at home. Remember, he's trying to bring his progressives in behind him. Would end imperialism, we'll get rid of all these old European practices, and we'll change the world. And the U.S. wins the war. We won. Wasn't it a great success? No. Because Wilson justified this deviation from tradition by a set of expectations that did not prove true. Democracy didn't happen. Imperialism didn't end. There was deep disillusionment after the war. People rejected getting involved in these new institutions. Harding said, we just want the old isolationism, more or less. And the U.S. government reverted to this, despite the need for U.S. leadership and the problems that were there that people recognized, but the country was not willing to step up to it. No change. Okay, World War II. Why do we get the big change in World War II? And what's the puzzle with World War II? The puzzle in World War II is not that change occurred. We all know change occurred. The puzzle is that the Soviet threat had nothing to do with that change. That change in the American worldview preceded the Soviet threat. That already by the time the Soviet threat emerged in 1945, when it became on people's maps that this was the new challenge, Americans had already recognized that their willingness to become involved and committed in European affairs had changed, and they recognized the need to do that. Why? Because they were pursuing the old ideas in the interwar period, viciously pursuing the old ideas. And every time they pursued these old ideas more, they got worse and worse results, right? So the 30s, the Neutrality Acts, what happens? The threat just gets worse. The problems in Europe get worse. Franklin Roosevelt wants to change things, right? He's an internationalist the whole time, but he knows he can only do so much when he's working with a popular mindset that is not easily changed. So he laid the groundwork. He helped people to support an alternative mindset that would replace it, but it wasn't until the big events that finally came crashing one upon another, the invasion of France, and the series of events through the 30s, leading up, of course, to the Soviet invasion, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, and then Pearl Harbor, that it was clear that the old way of doing things, staying out, no longer could provide security for the United States. And there was a massive change in public opinion and government attitudes that we need to do something different. Now, to be sure, after the war, there was still a debate about bringing the troops home, but there was never a debate about the need to react preventively in terms of military commitments should there be a threat in Europe, right? And that's why it was easier than it certainly would have been the case earlier to mobilize such a large effort in the 50s to deal with the Soviet challenge. Third event, end of the Cold War. Major change in the international arena. The Soviet Union has collapsed. Supposedly the whole reason why the U.S. has been so engaged abroad in Asia and Europe for the previous 40 years is gone. What happened? Nothing. U.S. strategy didn't change at all. Academics like myself and probably Frank wrote pieces or talked with people about the whole new world it was, and here's a great idea. Small forests were felled on what America's strategy should be now that the Cold War has ended. And what happened? Nothing. Not one element of U.S. strategy changed. Why? Because nothing went wrong. It worked. Why should we change things? What are the eggheads are talking about? We can't spend time reorienting our whole strategy, getting the whole foreign policy bureaucracy and the military to think differently. It's not going to happen. Okay. Continuity prevailed, right? Because there was no contradiction to prevailing ideas. Okay. Fast forward to 9/11. 9/11 hits. It's a major shock to the system. And in response to that, the administration of President Bush proposes a dramatic strategy that deviates from many of the principles of the post-war order and American tradition based on three principles. And those principles were preventive use of force. We're not going to wait for them to strike. We're going to strike first. Even if we don't think they're going to strike imminently, we still may need to strike before we even know they're going to strike, because down the road they may be a danger. Preventive use of force, as opposed to the Cold War, what I'll call the Atlantic Pact era, reactive use of force. Okay, one. Second, emphasis on unilateral means. The tradition during the Cold War era was multilateralism. Did the United States act unilaterally during the Cold War era? Of course it did. Did it have unilateralism as its doctrine? No, it did not. It was considered an exception to the rule, right? We will act multilaterally, unilaterally if we have to. Third, premise of what we'll call the Bush Revolution, Bush Doctrine, is the expansive use of force for regime change, right? That is a transgression of other regimes' boundaries outside of the Western Hemisphere. The U.S., of course, has a long tradition of intervening with troops in the Western Hemisphere to change regime types. But for most of the history, our intervention outside of the Western Hemisphere to change regime types has been covert, discreet. We pay others to do it. We usually don't throw our troops in there for the purpose of changing regimes. And indeed, military interventions, the norm in the post-war era, was multilateral generally. Not always, but generally. So each of these three, I'm sure you've heard talks on this before. There's some prominent scholars out there who see examples of each of these acts, preventive action, unilateralism, and coercive regime change prior to the Bush Revolution. There's no doubt about it. But if you put all these three together and make them doctrine, that's a significant change. And indeed, the person who wrote the National Security Strategy of 2002, a colleague of mine at the University of Virginia, Philip Zelikow, who's been a counselor to Condoleezza Rice over the past several years, said exactly that. This is a revolution in the way international affairs is going to be conducted. So there is no doubt that it was, in my mind at least, that it was an effort to alter the nature of international relations in U.S. foreign policy, and they believed it was justified based on U.S. primacy, and that it was a good way to order the world. Now, to make that case stick, though, they had to tell us what was going to come out of it. And the expectations was, we're going to do this for three reasons. We're going to defeat the terrorists, We're going to generate unprecedented great power cooperation. And we're going to spread democracy. Okay. Now, I mean, there's some chuckling. At the first two look pretty darn good. If you can think of the first year after 9/11, the invasion of Afghanistan was wildly successful and seemed to be a real blow to al-Qaeda and global terror efforts by that organization. Great power cooperation did seem to take a nice leap, right? Everyone was on board. Everyone was sympathetic to the U.S. Chinese-U.S. relations turned around on a dime from the horrible start and the P3 spy incident and where they had been right at the beginning of the administration. And democracy was off to the side at that point. And of course, since then, the results have turned around. Iraq has been a fiasco and a critical event in terms of how people have weighed that revolutionary effort, and there's been a large negative reaction and few results. So terrorism has not gotten better. The networks don't seem to be shrinking; they seem to be growing. Great power cooperation has frayed, to put it mildly. It started. There's been some more recently, at least in the U.S.-Europe link, but U.S.-Europe split. Things with Russia have gone downhill. China remains the one bright light in that, ironically, but there is some considerable distrust underlying the veneer of economic cooperation today. And democracy looked to have a few spurts, but has now gone completely backwards. That the efforts towards democratization seem to have been basically given up. So, I mean, I think what you see is what we all already know, which is that the administration has more or less reversed course and largely come back to the main principles that essentially drove our foreign policy since 1945. This thing I want to call Atlantic Pac internationalism. There's been a lot more multilateral cooperation, intervention, preemption has been not discussed at all, and democratization is nodded to, but there's no longer making tough decisions on not cooperating with autocracies who may in fact be helpful to the United States in the future. So that's good news, right? We're back. Even the revolutionary has come back to the fold, and the country is now on a good course. Well, if you see the kind of argument I'm trying to make about ideas and rhetoric and results and the way those interact, I think you might see some more disturbing possibilities. And that the Atlantic Pac internationalism today, as we look into the future, is going to be quite fragile. And there are two reasons for this. The first is rhetoric, and that is that everyone in trying to distance themselves, most everyone, trying to distance themselves from the disaster of Iraq in the past few years, are trying to set out that they're going to handle foreign policy differently. And most of it is much more in the direction of Atlantic Pac internationalism. We're going to go out, we're going to work with allies, we're going to fight terrorism, and even the tougher lines, if people want to take a harder line with the use of force, say we're going to get others to contribute to this too. So they want to go more in that direction. And lead us to expect that whoever the next president is going to do that, and it's going to provide good things for the country, right? But the problem is that it's now facing extremely difficult conditions for that policy to work in the same way that it's worked in the past. And let me just lay out a few reasons why that's the case. First, the old institutions, the institutional architecture that has structured international relations, the UN, the WTO, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, are crumbling. They're under siege. They're not doing well. They need new life. Everyone knows there are problems. So that you don't have as ready an architecture as you had in the past to make these things work. New countries want to have new voices, and there's been extreme resistance to change any of this, and that makes it a tough vehicles for these old institutions to breathe new life into another round of Atlantic Pact internationalism. Second reason, the rise of Asia. Remember, the liberal internationalism was a U.S.-European compact. Right? It was a U.S.-European compact that the rest of the world more or less had to follow. With the rise of China and Japan's continuing strength and the rise of India, but especially the rise of China, that deal is not going to work anymore. Not for the long run, not for the period that's going to go out over the next 10 or 20 years, and that's going to make the old Atlantic Pact internationalism a tough thing. Third, anti-Americanism. People out there have not liked what we have done the past 7 years. Maybe it's because the United States has had so much power and no one likes the big guy, whether they're nice or they're not nice. But anti-Americanism is growing. It's still growing. And so they may not be ready to embrace the next president. I don't know. This is an open question. Some people believe that it's strictly a stigmatization that's limited to the Bush administration and perhaps, comments by Secretary Rumsfeld on old Europe and this kind of thing. But I'm not so sure about that. So I think that the next president, should they have a desire to renew liberal internationalism, they're going to have a tougher road to hoe, and that's going to be tougher to produce results. And we're all going to be looking for results because we're going to be looking at their ideas and wondering if those ideas work anymore. Finally, the fourth thing why conditions have changed a lot is declining or the prospect of declining U.S. financial clout, right? We have financial issues here in the United States. We're a marvelous, thriving, wealthy country, but we are up to our eyeballs in debt, and the Chinese are paying for it. And at some point, that is going to impede our ability to go out and cut the deals that made liberal internationalism work. Remember when we set up, building on the European model, when we set up liberal internationalism, the international architecture after World War II, we were what, 49% of the world's GNP. We're now down to 24 to 26, and it's declining, and we don't want to be able to grease all the palms, right? You got to cut these deals. You got to grease palms. There's payoffs, even if you're the big guy, and our ability to do that is declining. It's still substantial. Don't get me wrong. We still have a lot of cards, but it's a tougher row to hoe. So my concern is when that next president comes in, and could be a Republican, could be Democrat, but I think the odds are either way they're going to be pushing this kind of line, distinguishing themselves in this direction. There's a danger of the whole internationalist ethos doing something radically different. And in my mind, there's two possible directions. One is a neo-isolationist move. Of course, we're not going to return to the 1920s, right? We're embedded in the international economy. So that's not going to change. But the country's willingness to project a lot of troops abroad to deal with dangerous situations that threaten international order, whether they be in the Balkans or in Asia, is going to decline. Right? America's willingness to bail out countries that are financially troubled is going to decline, as we did with Mexico in the 1990s. Of course, we bailed out New York banks in doing that, but there's going to be a reaction to that. And so I worry, and I think it's a true and significant danger that there is, at some point, there could be a reaction to all this. Why are we out there? Why are we out? They don't like us? No good things are happening. no one agrees with the way we see things, and there'll be a pullback, right? Not the 1920s, but enough of a pullback that things fall apart more in the world, because I do believe that things stay together because of the U.S. leadership role. The second possibility, of course, is that it goes in a completely different direction, in an ultra-nationalist direction, a kind of steroid nationalism, in which this one's harder to imagine, but the right attack, the right attack that implicates another country could lead to a very powerful emotional reaction. But that course, I think, is much less likely. And I invite you in the Q&A to tell me what other visions might be out there for where the country's going to go, if in fact liberal internationalism is in danger, as I think it is. So what's the positive vision? Looking beyond doom and gloom. I personally think it's desirable that leaders start to will use rhetoric that is realistic about the possibilities for internationalism in the future, recognizing the limitations to it, that it's not going to be the cure-all answer, and there's going to be some hard things and hard choices to make that may not lead to immediately happy outcomes in terms of pursuing a different type of international order. And I believe that we do have to pursue a different type of international order. And that, of course, starts with bringing in rising powers into the international political structure, including a China whose government we don't necessarily love today, but whose economy we do. But it's a country that I think is changing slowly, but changing consistently in the right direction. That is, China is a liberalizing country, and I think that bringing it in more is going to help liberalize it more and stabilize it more. And that's one concrete thing we can do to developing a new international order that works. Second, of course, is recast the fight on terrorism, the war on terrorism. Making it a war sounds like we should be getting victory, like there is one final battle to make it work. I understand why President Bush did that. He had to mobilize the public and the bureaucracy to deal with it. But at this point, it's time to recast it into what it is, which is a long-term international criminal conflict that we need to deal with, not simply as a war, but with a variety of other measures that leave the war image out, because it's hard to fulfill that war image. We'll constantly want victory, and it won't be there, and all it will do is delegitimize the efforts we're trying to make. And finally, of course, we need to encourage our allies who are increasingly wealthy, that is the European Union, and others, to contribute more to the common good. It's not like they're doing it, but there's certainly more they can do, and Americans want that to happen. The thing we least want, so the polls say, is to be leaders out there, and to Americans that means footing the bill, and that problem has to be dealt with. So what I'm arguing for is that the future of liberal internationalism, of which I'm a supporter, needs to avoid the fate of the isolationists after World War I, right? And the fate of the isolationists after World War I is they thought they'd won a great victory when Wilson had been defeated. And what they'd really created was a brittle structure of ideas that was no longer suited to the position of the United States in the world and the demands of world politics at that time. And I think liberal internationalism risks that same brittleness today, and we need to act to avoid its imminent demise in another similar, very undesirable chain of events as those we saw in the 1930s. Thank you very much, and welcome your questions.
Well, we certainly thank you, and I think worldview is, in the dictionary, something like a comprehensive view of the world from a particular perspective especially. And you certainly have given us that and dealt with a most complex matter. Endlessly interesting. The floor is open for questions. The question is the impulse to war. Is it a genetically based drive, or can you suggest alternative explanations for it?
Yeah. Well, I would say that everything we do has a genetic basis, no doubt about that. But the same genetic basis has led the United States to embrace refusing to deal with the international order. It's led it to embrace integrating itself in that international order, and it's led it to at least try to completely revolutionize that order. Where there's a genetic basis, that genetic basis can allow many different outcomes. So our genetic basis has allowed us to experience decades of wonderful peace and prosperity, and it's also allowed us to do a lot of killing. And of course, we know that in the terms of the genetics of it, there is a difference between men and women, and men are genetically, statistically, clearly more prone to violence than women. We know that. One of my colleagues, not at UVA in the field, I was at a conference with last week, Frank Fukuyama has kind of laid out an article on this, and he's argued, look, democratization is great because it brings in more women into politics, which offsets the male genetic tendency, right? Because a lot of times in the old days, women were kept out. But despite that shift, we still, of course, see the country, the United States, a democracy where, of course, there is a female vote. There is no clear correlation between that female vote and decisions for war and peace, because there are, of course, many female supporters of those decisions, as there are men.
If you have a recalcitrant opponent and you don't have the military option, do you foresee more covert activity on part of the United States?
Right, and the part of it being especially because the rise of isolationist sentiment, you're saying, yeah. I mean, if you look at the polls, there isn't a huge rise of isolationist sentiment. This is the puzzling thing, right? I mean, the U.S. is, we are caught, we being broader citizens are caught in this internationalist frame, right? We still hold those views just as we held extremely non-internationalist views in the 1930s. But I do agree with you that opinion has shifted away from using hard power to change some of these distant situations. And I think that inevitably does lead to more covert means because governments feel like they have to do something along those lines. And I'm fairly sure that we are involved in covert activities. I know nothing about it. I don't have a security clearance. I realize an official from the State Department made news here a couple weeks ago. So here's the line. We've got covert activities going on in Iran as we speak. But how substantial those are, I have no clue. But I do agree with your sentiment that's generally how, when sentiment comes up against something in foreign policy, governments, the U.S. included, tend to shift somewhat to covert means, which of course have their limitations as well. Yeah.
I think the question is, if something really awful happens in the Middle East, and there's some pretty bad things going on, as we all know, but something beyond all of this, what would be the reaction of the American public on one hand? And on the other hand, how disinvolved would our allies continue to be?
There's no doubt that opinion on Iraq is going consistently in a negative direction, that there is great skepticism of what is going on there, that is growing, and it differs somewhat by party. Republicans, of course, are much stronger support for the president in Iraq, and the Democrats have all left already. But the erosion you're seeing is on the Republican side. So our willingness to remain there is on the decline. Now, just let me do the Vietnam analogy, which you talked about, which the U.S. didn't want to engage itself in any more wars after Vietnam. I would footnote that our overall commitment to international order and our commitment to allies and their security and our stationing of troops abroad wasn't affected by Vietnam at all. Right? The Cold War was still on. What changed was our need or felt desire to defend every country against communism, that every country mattered. Hold it, maybe every country doesn't matter, and we're just going to spend a lot of treasure doing that. But we're still out there, and we're still going to be involved in this broader order to deal with the Soviet Union, right? So, then coming back to Iraq, what would it mean for U.S. foreign policy if we take it on the chin there in the same Vietnam style? I think it would mean regime change, forceful regime change, is a bad idea, and even preventive forceful regime change to take care of what if they might get nuclear weapons is probably a bad idea. But I don't think we would withdraw from the struggle, I'll use that word, with terrorism in any regards. We would use different means. Now with the Allies, things go south in Iraq, no one's coming to help us. I think that's pretty clear, because their calculation is this: if the Americans can't do it, what are we going to do there? We're going to get slammed. They'll talk about, the European Union will talk about our alternative plan for causing peace. We do civilian engagement and, neighborhood to neighborhood and things like that. And they do that, and they will do that, but that won't resolve any of if there's a rising conflagration that goes on there. Yeah.
Aside from assertiveness in Lane Burke's first question, of course, when the Department of War was created, I'm pretty sure the legislation also was talking about a Department of Peace as well years ago. And of course, you're being linked with the Institute for Peace. The other half of her question clearly is how can one build institutions which emphasize peaceful solutions as opposed to the use of force, to be fair to that first question.
Yeah, and that's a great question, which why I avoided answering it. Slowly and patiently would be the answer. I mean, we have an arc. There's no one institution that can preserve the peace, because that would be a collective security institution, which I find very difficult to imagine working in a way that would endure for any period of time. Now, that's it. So my view of peace is a series of overlapping institutions that give countries so many overlapping interests that you no longer think about war, even if you want to punch the other person, or they've done something that really irritates you. This happens sometimes between, for example, France and Great Britain, but they don't do that because there's just so much intertwined between them that it makes war difficult. So peace, in my mind, is a product of a network of overlapping interests across many issues, including the economy, especially the economy, but including the economy, health, increasingly the environment, and just the thousands of other issues where there is a kind of civil society taking place, and we need to build broader government structures that bring in, again, these new powers and give them a buy-in stake in this kind of thing that makes it acceptable to all. And that means, at some point, I think it means obviously giving some on what the United States wants, but you have to separate the whole deal from the main things. And my belief is that even with a country like China, and in the direction China's going, and there's clear there's clear gaps there between what the political values in China today versus the United States. I believe those things are coming together and can be actually facilitated through a better institutional structure in Asia. Not some grand new institution, but simply building on some of the ones they have there now and rethinking some of our existing financial institutions in terms of voter stakes and things like the IMF, World Bank, that would start to bring in some of these countries. Yeah.
Do you believe that the internet, international business, globalization, can lead to the devolution or disappearance of the nation state?
Yes, I do. The state remains the main pivot of power and vehicle for interaction in international affairs, but that power is dispersing. And probably there's a lot of people in this room who've been involved with non-governmental organizations that have worked across borders and learned a lot of things and think things differently because of that. So, I mean, the short answer is yes, and to some extent it worries me because the state has been probably the greatest vehicle for dastardly deeds in history, but it's also been perhaps the greatest vehicle for good too. So that's my liberal and my libertarian sides coming together there. But yes, I do think the power of the state is decreasing, and I think you see it in the way the State Department operates. The State Department now interacts quite a bit with non-governmental organizations. They learn a lot from non-governmental organizations. There's a lot of ways of power out there except the State Department. And of course, that's where we were in the 1920s as well. The State Department was small and not that active, and most of what went on in international affairs was outside of the State Department. Of course, that came with its own problems, but yeah.
What are the prospects of evolution of a global law as a kind of stabilizing creation of international order? And I think you'd like a comment on international business as well.
Questioning whether global free trade can work without global law.
Sorry about that. I just badly missed that. Can free trade work without international law?
Right. So the parallel is the conversation we have in states, which is, can you have a really functioning capitalist system without rule of law, right? And this is the challenge that China faces today, which is, are there limits to its ability to grow without rule of law to sustain contracts and all that goes with that, which ultimately underlies, property rights, which ultimately are the kinds of things that make economies go, right? They make the system work. So on a global level, can you have a really functioning global economy without global rule of law? And I guess the answer is no, you can't. And of course, there is international law out there, and the international law that's out there is probably best developed in commerce. Right? There's a lot of international law that goes on in cases that are tried that affect how international commerce and trade work. And now there is a variety of additional things which someday may become law, corporate codes of conduct, so on and so forth. So the premise I totally agree with. Does that mean that economics will drive us eventually to a world state? I'm more skeptical of that extreme proposition. I can see you shaking your head. You agree, but I do believe that that inevitably, with probably significant steps backward, we will develop more international law. And by the way, have you noticed that even in the Bush administration, there has been more friendly moves towards things like the International Criminal Court? I mean, the principles haven't changed. They still believe that you can't give up U.S. sovereignty, but they're less dogmatic, and there's more hints to forums that you need to do that. And of course, international law in the commercial front was never a problem, has not been a problem for any of our presidents. So I do think there will be more in that direction. Will you get to a rule of law internationally? That part I'm more skeptical about. Yeah.
The focal point is Venezuela, almost as many ramifications as with Worldview. And the question is, what are going to be the ramifications of it? And are we going to act in some negative way against it? I think the question is simply to get your observations on the impact of Venezuela on American policy.
Yeah. The danger, of course, of the title of my talk was that nothing can be excluded from it. And it somehow suggests that I have a finer grained understanding of all these regions of the world than I do. And the way you asked that question made me think that you ought to come up and answer that question because you already know a whole lot more than I know on it. But certainly been paying attention to it, and I think the administration has handled that one pretty well. That is, they've handled it pretty well to the extent they haven't said a whole lot about it. And just let this guy do his thing. He's going to oversell his case, and let the political dynamics develop there on their own, and not do the precedent that you were suggesting. Yeah, exactly. That I think would be a big mistake.
The question is, would the changes that you see in the Bush doctrine have taken place if the Republicans had been successful in the congressional elections of last November?
Yes. I think the changes preceded that election. I think they've been going on certainly since 2005 in many different ways, but there's no doubt.
Give me one major example.
Well, on democracy, there was some hard moves made against our allies in Egypt and in other places that were completely reversed before the elections. We no longer were pressuring Cairo before the 2006 election. That's one. The second, I think they were already moving to more cooperative work on Iran before the election. Now, I don't want to say it's immaterial. I think you're right that they've had to reverse more, especially verbally. But I think in action, especially since Condoleezza Rice became Secretary of State, there's been a shift away there's been a shift back to some of the more traditional Cold War patterns of dealing with allies and international action.
How do you anticipate our worldview changing as our importance in the world economically and in other ways becomes much less relative to other powers?
Well, it's a great question, and especially in connection with the rise of China, you were saying. There's no doubt we've had a good run of things. And boy, those low interest rates were great. I put an addition on my house, refinanced. That was wonderful. And when I spent my year in China, I thanked as many people as I could for that, because of course they're buying all the debt that keeps our interest rates low. And at some point that's going to come to an end. It just can't continue forever. Fortunately, it doesn't give China a huge amount of leverage because they're critically dependent on our economy. So they are now locked into their own habit of buying funding our credit card debt and mortgage debt, because if they pull the plug, then our economy tanks. We don't buy any more from China, and the leaders of China can say goodbye to their legitimacy, which is completely dependent on the economic recovery, because there is no ideological legitimacy that they have today. It's all about the economy. So as China rises, will it affect the U.S. worldview? I can't help but think it will. It will necessarily have to. It will change our view of ourselves as the light of the world. If it continues, and there's no guarantee China's rise is going to continue, and we're going to be really in danger if they should plunge dramatically, because then I think China could become very dangerous. But it will change our, they are, that system today, everything, I wasn't alive in the 1890s. Frank may have been. But
Everyone's younger than I am.
But that go-go capitalism and the infinite possibilities of the country, even despite the kind of inequalities of wealth. I mean, that's China today, and that whole the energy is just unbelievable. And at some point, if things continue, and there's no guarantee they will, that will affect the way we view ourselves, the way we view the world. Why are we out there? We're no longer the leader. It's China's the leader. And again, I see that putting pressure at some point, perhaps, on tendencies to withdraw a little bit, one side of it. The other side, of course, is, as everyone knows, there's a strong view in this country that we need to get unentangled with China and stop helping them grow, because they're going to be a problem. And that's, of course, the other possible reaction that could come out of China's growth, which is a nervous United States getting involved in a way that spurs conflict, right? In the history of international relations, there's a pretty strong record of when dominant powers, when rising powers rise and dominant powers decline, there is often major wars. And those major wars are not started by the challengers, because the challengers are happy. Things are working out just fine. Why do we want war? Those wars are started by the decliners, right? They're started by the party that is becoming insecure about their place in the world and fear that they will no longer have their say as their power declines. So that's the other way that the rise of China could affect the American worldview.
I can't resist noting a long time ago, not the 1890s, but a long time ago, a press conference that I was watching, a presidential one, which I've never seen quoted, had the American president say that when we would no longer be the world's greatest power, he hoped that we would be remembered as having used our power well, which is a more gentle view than perhaps the unhappy fellow going from the top to a lower position. These have been a lot of fun. All the questions nicely
Great
answered.
questions.
It's been a good evening for us, and for that we thank you enormously.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.